Today is February 1st, and there's a topic that I'd like to talk about. I was thinking about writing an article, but I just feel like this is a topic that is communicated much more effectively by video or even face to face. And I'd rather not write an article about it, but talk about it and hopefully start some discussion so that we can move forward on this issue and avoid the troubles that it causes in the lives of students and parents. I've been working in education full time for over 20 years now, and I've taught thousands of students. I've had every different kind of student in a multitude of different circumstances, whether in private schools or um, homeschools, online studies, in-person schooling, and so on. And by God's grace, I've had the privilege of seeing a number of my students move on to religious vocations in a time when it's common for people to say that there's a vocations crisis and treat that vocations crisis as if it's some kind of mystery. As a classics teacher, I don't believe that the vocations crisis is a mystery. I believe it's a logical and understandable consequence of modern education. And I'd like to address a couple things in a brief talk. And then, as I said, invite discussion if anyone's interested in getting deeper into it. If you're a student working in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy who enjoys his or her studies, you enjoy reading the Bible every day, you enjoy studying the Catechism, you enjoy reading Aesop's fables or Aristotle's works on reasoning and philosophy, you enjoy studying St. Thomas Aquinas, you read these things, and though they may be challenging, you enjoy them and you'd like to study them more, and you really get into them. You get into the languages and all of these different subjects, and you say, oh, I wish I could just study more and more and more. I love my studies. I love these subjects. I want to be wise. I want to know these things. I want to know the faith. I want to know true Christian philosophy. I want to know the languages. I want to master the scriptures, on and on. What's going to happen is you're going to get into your teen years, and all of a sudden people are going to start pressuring you with questions about what you're going to do to get a job or to go to college or to have a career or to get married and so on. And you're going to find that there's a conflict between the studies that you enjoy in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and the pressures of life as it regards getting a job, making a living, earning money, and so on. You're going to see that these two things don't go together. They draw you in opposite directions. And for most students in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, at some point, they abandon all of these classical Catholic studies, and they just devote themselves to whatever is necessary for them to get a job or go to college or establish a career or get married and so on. And that's their choice. But what I want you to know is that that choice is not necessary. You do not need to get a job. You do not need to go to college. You don't need to choose a career. You don't need to get married. You don't need to work in the world to earn money. You don't need to compete with other people for money. You never, ever need to do those things. That way of life is a choice. Life in the world is a choice, and Christians have the opportunity to choose to not do so. So rather than abandoning classical studies or Catholic studies, you can choose to pursue them for your entire life. You can choose to seek wisdom and not be distracted by worldly concerns. You can choose to pursue wisdom in Christian studies, even Christian works, without any competition against other people for money, without having to charge people for the good works that you do, without having to submit yourself to others for approval or employment or admission. You don't need to do those things. As a Christian, you can choose a contemplative life, you can choose religious life, you can choose the priestly ministry. There are options open to you that make it false for anyone to tell you that you need to get a job. When I was in college, I wanted to study Scripture. I wanted to know the Scriptures. And as I read the writings of commentators and great teachers of Scripture, what I noticed was the ones who were really effective, they taught because they knew the languages, the history, the philosophy, and so on. And so I said to myself, I want to know the Scriptures the way they do. And so I studied classics so that I could understand the Scriptures. In fact, I studied classics and ancient history. That was my program of studies when I was in college. And the reason why I chose that was simply because I wanted to study and understand the Bible. That's it. That's why I chose it. I didn't have plans for my career. I didn't have an answer if someone was to ask me, how are you going to make money with this? That wasn't why I was studying it, and I wouldn't have had an answer for them. To this day, I would never be able to give someone an answer if they asked me, how am I going to make money tomorrow? I've never had to worry about that, and I never think about that. I think about how can I serve God in the best way possible, and ever since I was 20 years old, everything that I've ever needed has been provided for. From a wife, when I was 17 years old, I met my wife. I never dated, never sought girls, never, had to worry about finding anyone. A girl walked right into my life when I was 17, and both of us knew almost from the moment we met that we were going to get married one day. I never had to think about a wife. I never had to think about a job, a career, anything. God provided for everything. And all I did was think about what I need to do to become wiser, more holy, more devout, and so on. So when people put that pressure on you, it's not true. That's not how it works. In fact, for Christians, it works the other way around. But what's more important is that while my situation in life is a bit extraordinary because my opportunities were very, very rare and unusual, my life circumstances are very unusual. To be married with children and be able to make a living teaching the classical liberal arts is just a situation that could never be planned and never was planned. It just was God's will for my life, and God's provided for me to do this work. But the normal course of life for a young man or a young woman who loves classical Catholic studies and wants to pursue them without distraction, without any thoughts of money making or business or competition in a worldly market or anything like that. The normal option for life that you need to consider is religious life, a religious vocation. Now, the way that you should think about a religious vocation is you should think about the benefits that religious life offers you. Religious life offers you the opportunity to serve God without distraction, to study and seek wisdom without distraction, to pursue holiness, to prepare for eternal life without distraction. That's the purpose of religious life. In His providence, God has made it possible so that any Catholic young adult can choose to say no thank you to the world and business and money making and can choose instead to enter into a religious community where none of those pressures exist, where there's no need to get a job, there's no need to make money, there's no need to impress an employer in a job interview, there's no need to apply for admission to a college and hope that you did what they want you to do to get admitted. God offers the opportunity for Catholics, especially Catholics in the classical liberal arts academies, studying wisdom and philosophy and languages and theology, a chance to choose to devote their whole lives to those studies without giving them up under worldly pressures. So I want to provide a voice coming to you from a different direction, as I'm sure that people around you will provide the pressure for you to pursue worldly things and abandon your studies. I'd like to offer an opposing voice saying, you shouldn't abandon your studies if you love them. If you want to pursue these things without distraction, with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, with attention and devotion, you can and you should. To do so, you'll likely be best served by joining a religious community that shares your specific interests and gifts and that has a mission that you really love and want to be a part of. There are many different religious communities. Some of them you wouldn't do well in because they're not for you. Others you'll find are more like what you're interested in. But there will be one or two that really match your interests and desires and sense of God's will in a more perfect way. And you will find the greatest happiness in your life when you enter into that place and live that life that God's calling you to. The benefits of religious life are very, very great. For one, peace of mind, tranquility, freedom from distractions, freedom from temptations, immersion in a holy environment that supports your desire to pursue wisdom and holiness, the comfort and encouragement of fellow members of a community who share your interests and vocation and desires and can pursue them with you. You'll often see when you watch or read saint biographies that they have spiritual friends who are companions with them as they pursued wisdom and holiness in their lives. And you'll find friends like that in a religious community where your gifts and desires are shared by others. You'll gain so many benefits in a religious community, and the cost of entering that community is actually very, very little. We'll often hear people talk about what you have to give up for religious life. You have to sacrifice this and that and this. And they make it sound like it's heavy and burdensome. And that's because they compare it to nothing. The truth is, you should look at a worldly life and consider what that life's going to cost you in terms of work, toil, anxiety, confusion, frustration, temptation, and so on. You should look at those things and consider what a worldly life is going to cost you. And then when you consider those costs of the worldly life, then you should consider the costs of the religious life. And what the religious life would cost you. First of all, you'd avoid the pressures, the anxieties, the confusion, the temptation, the difficulties of that secular life. Because face it, in the world, when God cursed Adam back in Genesis, he said, all the days of your life you'll toil, by the sweat of your brow you will earn your bread. And that's the lot of anyone in the world. You can dress it up, you can make it look fancy, you can give it a fancy name, but what it comes down to is you will toil and labor by the sweat of your brow to get your bread in the world. Now, some have what appears to be prosperity, and they can store up all sorts of treasures and luxuries. But what does Jesus say about that? He says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth. And then he goes through a list of problems that people have who store up treasures. Moths destroy them. Rust corrupts them. Thieves break in and steal them. That's the reality of riches in the world. First of all, you have to toil and labor to get them, and then when you get them, they decay and are ruined or are stolen and broken. And what are you left with in the end? Not very much. And so the attraction of the world is largely found to be a mirage or a deception. And the costs of that life are very great. Even if you were able to gain the whole world, Jesus asks, what would it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? The day is going to come when you're old and weak and ready to die, and none of these things are going to matter. All that's going to matter at the moment of your death is whether or not you are in the grace of God and prepared for eternal life or not. That's all that's going to matter. And so you can choose one course of life that's going to lead you through endless labors, endless anxieties and worries and toils, some prosperity and treasures which are going to be destroyed and corrupted, if not stolen. And in the end, all that's going to matter is the state of your soul. So why would you choose that life? Why would you choose that life? On the other hand, you have a life devoted to God, a life of contemplation and prayer, of worship and Christian service, with no thoughts of money, no thoughts of possessions, no distractions, no temptations. Surely some temptations, but nothing like you'd have in the world. And for what cost? What's the cost of this safe and peaceful way to heaven? What's the cost? Well, for most religious communities, there are 3 vows that members have to take. And remember, when we consider these vows, they may seem sacrificial, but we have to compare them to what it's going to cost you to live in the world. We have to compare the costs of the religious life with the costs of a life in the world, which I just described. Now, the 3 vows that are taken by religious are reasonable, simple sacrifices. They're not great. The people who make a fuss about them don't appreciate the benefits that are gained in religious life. They think about the sacrifices because they don't appreciate the benefits. Now, the benefits of religious life, as I said, peace, tranquility, freedom from distraction, freedom from avoidable temptations, companionship, an environment that supports your spiritual life, and so on. The costs are very, very little compared to the benefits that are gained. When you live at home with your parents, you live in their house, mom and dad provide everything you need. They give you your food, your clothing, the home you live in, the bed you sleep in. They pay for the utilities. They pay for the lights in the room you're studying in. They pay for your heating and air conditioning. Everything that you have growing up is provided by your parents. And in exchange for all of those benefits, the 10 Commandments require that you show them honor and you obey them. That's what it costs you reasonably and rightly for all of those benefits. They give you all of those things out of their own love and goodwill, and in exchange for them, in gratitude, you give them honor and obedience while you live with them and throughout life. But while you live with your parents, you're required by God's commands to respect their rules and obey them while you live with them. Now, if you were to leave your parents' house and go and live in a different community, and that community was going to give you a place to live, clothing, food, books, studies, all kinds of resources to allow you to enjoy a peaceful spiritual life, you would owe that community, just as you owe your parents, you would owe them an obedience. And so in each religious community, they have a rule of life, rules that all the members of the community are to follow, schedule, a daily order of activities, diet, dress, and so on, a rule for the community. To enter into that community and receive all of those benefits, you have to agree to abide by the rules. You have to vow obedience to the superior of the religious community. So that's one of the sacrifices that you need to make for religious life, a vow of obedience. But as you can see, it's very reasonable, and you already have the same requirement in your life at home. If you go and work in the world, you're going to have to obey your employers or they'll just fire you. So no matter where you go in life, you're going to owe obedience and respect to anyone that you're dependent on. Who would you rather be dependent on? And who would you rather owe obedience? Someone in the world or a religious superior in a religious community? Who would you rather obey and promise to obey? So the sacrifice of obedience is not a very great sacrifice. And if you choose to not pursue religious life, you don't get out of it. You simply have to obey someone else, someone possibly worse. That's the first sacrifice of religious life. And as you can see, it's a light and reasonable sacrifice. The second sacrifice is that you must take a vow of poverty. Now, this vow of poverty doesn't mean you need to live in a street with no food, clothing, or shelter. It's not destitute poverty. It's voluntary poverty for a purpose. It's poverty for a purpose. And the word poverty is misleading because we associate it with destitution, with homelessness, or with starving, children in third world countries. The poverty that we're talking about in religious life is the philosopher's poverty. This isn't something that just religious have to accept. Anyone who desires to do anything in the world has to accept the conditions that come with that activity. For example, if you learn about the richest men in the world, men like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, if you learn about their lives, you'll find that when they were young, when they were getting started, when they were working to develop the programs and businesses that they have developed, that they're now famous for, they were living in very, very difficult conditions. For example, Elon Musk lived in his office. That's all he had. Jeff Bezos started Amazon and was running Amazon out of his office in his house, a little home office. You'll find many stories of famous, wealthy people who slept under their desk at night, who lived in their cars while they started their businesses. Anytime men undertake some great, ambitious task that they desire, they accept whatever conditions come with it. That's how they accomplish that. If you look at famous athletes, you may see an athlete who's making millions of dollars as a 30-year-old man. But if you go back to his younger days and look back to his teenage years or his college years, the early years of his career, you'll find that he had to accept very, very tight living conditions in order to concentrate on the practice and the training and the exercise that was needed to become a professional athlete. You see the reward, but you often don't see the sacrifice. You see the successful business and the billionaire, but you don't see that those men often started very simply in humble conditions, accepting any conditions so that they could pursue their dream. Well, if the pursuit of a spiritual life, of a contemplative life, of a holy life, if that's your dream, won't you accept any conditions? Won't you accept any conditions to have that? Well, the second vow that a religious must make is a vow of poverty. And all that that means is that the person is willing to live in whatever material conditions, in whatever material conditions that life requires. And so if it's poverty, he'll accept poverty. If there's wealth and comfort, he'll accept wealth and comfort. But he'll accept those conditions, and normally those conditions will be very, very simple. Simple clothing, just what's necessary. Simple food, just what's necessary. Simple living or housing conditions, a bed, a blanket, a place to get washed. Simple living. That's what it means to accept a life of voluntary poverty. But remember, for the sake of those benefits that are to be gained, which are invaluable, the vow of poverty is simply an agreement to live in simple conditions for the sake of those great goals that are desired, the benefits that are sought in a religious community. The third promise that a religious needs to make is referred to as a vow of chastity. Now, often this is presented to worldly, modern students who are dating, watching television, watching movies, all about romance and love and all these things. They're under all kinds of peer pressure over relationships and these things. And into that worldly, foolish culture, someone comes to talk about a vow of chastity, and it sounds ridiculous. Because in that culture, it is ridiculous. That culture should not exist, especially in Christian environments. That culture shouldn't exist in a Christian school or a Catholic school or a Catholic university. That culture of romance and dating and relationships shouldn't even exist in the first place. And so the vow of chastity sounds ridiculous and crazy. But if we step back and just think about the duties of family life, it'll make sense, and it can be thought of in a much more sensible way. Your parents, in giving birth to you, became responsible to provide for all of your material and intellectual and spiritual needs. They made promises at your baptism to raise you in the faith. They're required by law to provide for you physically, to feed and house and clothe you. They're required even legally to provide for your education, to see that you get at least an education that's as good as a local public school offers. So these needs, intellectual needs, education, culture, housing, food, clothing, and so on, these are the duties of parents toward their children. Now, if you say, I would like to not have to work in the world for money, I don't want to be pressured by business, I don't want to have to think about charging people for good works I do, I want to live free from any concern of money, free from all love of money, focused on God, focused on wisdom, a life of peace and quiet and contemplation. If you want that life, then there's no way that you could provide for a family and live that life. And so a reasonable sacrifice that needs to be made is you need to vow to not produce a family, to not get married and start a family. So the vow of chastity is very simply a commitment to a single life because you don't want to have to work to earn a living or make money. And if that's what you want, then you can't morally and responsibly produce children. So you can't marry a wife and promise to provide for her when you don't want to work in the world. You can't have children and then be responsible to provide for their material needs when you don't want to work in the world. If you don't want to work in the world, which is your prerogative, you may choose that. You have to accept the consequences that come with that. So all the benefits that are available come with a sacrifice. And that sacrifice is to live a single life. That's the vow of chastity. It doesn't have anything to do with relationships and all this, because outside of marriage, there are no moral relationships anyway. So even if you stay in the world, there's no romance and dating and or sexual relationships in the world that are allowed for people who are not religious. They're supposed to live chastely in the world. You're not allowed to live unchastely just because you choose to not be religious. So again, compare the costs of life in a religious community and life outside, where you still need to live chastely, but in the world. That same chastity can be offered as a sacrifice to gain for you the benefits of life in a religious community where you can study and pray and serve God without any worldly pressure, distractions, temptations, pressures to make money, pressures to do business, to compete in the marketplace, and so on. So what I want to make sure is that as a student, you know, first of all, that you do not need to get a job. You do not need to go to college. You do not need to choose a career. You do not need to get married. And you need to make sure you understand these things. If you have a desire to pray and study and be free to do these things, that desire is perfectly good and right, and you can pursue it. But there are ways to pursue it responsibly and rightly, and those ways are established by the church, and you need to learn about them. But I want to also make sure you understand, as you consider the costs of a religious life or a religious vocation, you compare them to what your costs are going to be in the world if you don't choose a religious life. The options are not live a strict, disciplined life as religious or live an easy, indulgent, lazy life in the world. That's not true. If you're going to be a Christian in the world, I would argue you need even more discipline, even more sacrifice, even more effort, because the cost will be even greater to save your soul and pursue holiness at the same time. If you're choosing the world because you want to indulge in worldly activity and sinful behavior and worldly pleasures, well, then we're not talking about Christianity then. We're just talking about worldliness. So that's not even an option for anyone who's interested in being a Christian. If you're going into the world, you need to have a plan how you're going to serve God and be holy and avoid sin. While you do that in the midst of a perverse and evil generation of people. How are you going to do that? How are you going to work honestly? Where are you going to work where you don't compromise morals and disobey God? Where you continue to pray and study and keep your eyes on eternal life? Where are you going? How are you going to do that in the world? Do you have a plan for that? If you feel the pressure of answering that question, that's the reality of this decision. It's very difficult. It's a dangerous path. Religious life is a safe path. And it's a path that's open to you. It's a path that you're free to choose. And you don't need to answer those questions about what you're going to do, where you're going to work, where you're going to go to school, how you're going to provide for yourself, and so on. You don't need to answer those questions. There's another option available to you as a Catholic, and it's religious life. So I like to make sure my students know that, because as you study in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, you're going to find that I don't think and talk about worldly things. The courses I offer, the lessons I write, They're not concerned with worldly things. I don't care about SAT scores. I'm not concerned about your high school transcripts because that just assumes you're applying somewhere to gain admission. And for what? Admission for what? A college? Everybody goes to college. It's not hard to get into college. You have to pay tens of thousands of dollars to go to college. You think the colleges really give people a hard time with admission? It's not hard to go to college. That's not a great achievement in life. There are colleges everywhere, hundreds and hundreds of colleges. Many of them accept anyone who applies. That's not a great achievement. That's not a big deal. You're going to get a job? You're worried about getting a job? That's all fine and good, but you still have to have wisdom to live a life. Do you have that wisdom? Are you going to actually make good use of money that you earn? Or are you just going to go from problem to problem to problem, wasting and losing everything you earn? Are you going to start businesses only to have them collapse and fail? Are you going to enter into a career field only to be unsuccessful in it? How are you going to be successful in a field or in life without wisdom? Are you going to start a family and remain married or end up divorced? You know what causes divorce? Financial problems, not knowing how to manage a household, not knowing how to have relationships with people, not knowing how to parent, not being generous and loving. You're going to run into the problems of not having a good spiritual life, not having wisdom, not being prudent. You're going to run into those problems. Those problems are going to ruin your life if you don't deal with them. Even if you manage to pretend that you're succeeding in getting into college or getting a job or buying a house or finding a wife, these weaknesses, lack of wisdom, lack of spiritual maturity, lack of virtue, lack of charity, they're just going to come and haunt you your entire life unless you seek them and get them. And then if you're going to seek them, how are you going to seek them? Where are you going to seek them? You're going to seek them in the world, surrounded with distractions? You just see it becomes a very endless pursuit of vanity, a fool's errand, to pretend that you're going to choose to enter into the world without assurance of God's blessing upon those choices. And it's very possible that God may lead you into a secular life or into a married life and bless and provide for you in that life so that you don't need to sin in order to enjoy a good life. But it's very difficult and very rare. And if you look at the saints, if you look at the lives of the saints, you'll see that most of them are religious. Most of them are monks, nuns, and priests. And that's not coincidental. That's because the life that they lived allowed them and helped them to become saints. So, most importantly, I don't want students being lured away from good and holy studies by worldly pressures and thoughts about jobs in college and so on. And at the same time, when the question comes of what way you'll choose, and you consider the sacrifices, I want you to see that the sacrifices required for religious life are very, very light in comparison with the benefits gained. And the sacrifices in secular life are very, very great in comparison with the benefits gained. And then when we consider the end of life, when all that will matter is the condition of our soul, would you rather prepare your soul for eternity in the world or in a religious vocation? The decision is really pretty simple. I think that most students today choose secular life because they simply don't understand religious life. I think the reason why we don't have priests and monks and nuns is not because God isn't inspiring anyone to be such. I think it's because young Catholic men and women don't understand. I don't think they get good advice. I don't think they get honest advice. I don't think their parents necessarily know what they need to hear. I think sometimes priests themselves aren't very hopeful in terms of seeing young people choose religious vocations. And I think there's just a whole host of problems, starting with Christian education today, modern education, that creates this apparent but not real vocations crisis. So you don't need a job. If you enjoy your studies, relax and enjoy them. You don't have to worry about what's next or whether you're going to get credit for your study of ethics. You don't need to worry about whether or not your Bible studies are going to help you on the SAT. You don't need to worry about whether the college down the road is going to value the years that you spent studying reasoning and rhetoric. I doubt they will, because that's not what college is for. These studies in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy are for wisdom. They're for the Christian life. We don't pursue them for college admission or for pay. And if you want to pursue these studies and you want to pursue Christian life, you want to pray and study and worship God and serve men with no thoughts of money or paychecks or business, then you should consider religious life. I'm sure that you have a lot of questions. There are a lot of questions to be asked and discussed on this issue because it's presented very poorly to modern students. And that's, as I said, why students aren't choosing religious vocations when they offer so many benefits. If you'd like to discuss these things, you can write to me or chat me anytime. I'm happy to talk about them. As I've said, I've helped students study and prepare for admission to seminaries and religious communities. I know what the communities require, what they seek. I can help you learn about different communities. I can put you in contact with people in those communities who can help you, and you can pursue a peaceful, happy Catholic life without having to answer these questions of what are you going to do for a living? Where are you going to go to college? How are you going to provide for yourself? And so on. You don't need to answer those questions. There's another way, and that may be the way God's leading you to. I hope that's a helpful talk. There's a million and one things we can continue to talk about, and I'm willing to do so. If you'd like to do so, contact me on the forum, by email, and I'll happily help you with these things. For parents, I encourage you to avoid putting worldly pressure on your children. They do not need to find jobs. They do not need to go to college. They do not need to choose a career or get married. They have the freedom to choose religious life. And you should be encouraging them to explore those options and learn about those options because that pressure doesn't exist on your children, and that should be a comfort to you as their parents. If there's anything you'd like to discuss, please contact me. God bless.